we're going to solve quadratic equations with factoring. We'll look at some pretty simple factoring techniques. We're only going to work with trinomials mostly. First, the zero product property. If A times B is equal to 0, then either A or B has to be 0. For example, I could have 0 times 8 equals 0, negative 2 times 0 equals 0, 4 times 0 equals 0, 0 times 100 equals 0, so on and so forth. But if your product is 0, then one of these two over here has to be 0. So that concept is what makes this work. So you have to understand that really before we do what we're going to do here. So our first example is going to be something that's already factored. X plus 1 times 2x minus 5 equals 0. This is the same concept as what I just showed you, except our factors are more complicated. I have two things. This is thing 1, this is thing 2, that multiply to give you 0. Therefore, it will be true if one of these two is 0. Doesn't matter which one, so we have to consider both. X plus 1 equals 0, or 2x minus 5 is equal to 0. So I'm going to solve both of those separately. X equals negative 1. Or x is equal to 5 halves. Notice I did solve those rather quickly, but at this point you should be fairly able to solve linear equations. And just by watching the process with no explanation should be sufficient. And you've been able to do that. So x is negative 1 or x is 5 halves. These are called solutions. And solutions in math, they're more specific than just to say the answer. Solutions specifically are things which, if inserted back into the original equation, will make that equation true. You also have solutions for inequalities, which is something that we'll talk about later. But negative 1 and 5 halves. In my second example, we'll have 3 examples. My second example, we're going to use factoring this off. X squared minus 8x plus 7 is equal to 0. This is called a quadratic equation. And quadratic equations are equations which the highest power is 2. You generally don't solve quadratic equations by isolating x. The problem is if I try to isolate x squared, the x will get in the way. You can't put those together because they're not like terms. So to isolate one would mean to put the other on the other side, and that causes trouble. So what we do instead, well, we have to think of different techniques. We're specifically going to factor here. If you remember to factor, we want to look for numbers which multiply to 7 and add to negative 8. Now, before we do that, I need to mention we need the equals 0 before we try to factor. Okay, on example 3, we'll have to get 0 we'll have to get a 0 before we actually factor. We'll do that in a minute. So factors of 7. Well, that's a pretty short list. 7 is a prime number, so the only factors of 7 are 7 and 1. Okay, so I'm going to write 7 and 1. Personally, when I factor these, I like to write the larger number first, though you don't have to. The reason I like to write the larger number first is because the larger the two numbers, now that's without considering sign, the larger the two numbers will always inherit this first sign. So it's helpful to keep from getting your signs mixed up. Now you have to think about the second sign. It doesn't necessarily match here. Negative 7 times what makes positive 7? Well, this would also have to be a negative if we're going to get a positive product. Also, negative 7 plus negative 1 makes negative 8. So this is the correct factorization. So if you're able to factor, now we basically do what we just did on number 1. You have two things which multiply together to give you 0. In order to make that true, either this or this must be 0. So I consider both. Either x minus 7 is equal to 0, or x minus 1 is equal to 0. So x is 7, or x is 1. All right, so we have x equals 7 or x equals 1. Those are my two solutions. Okay. You typically have two solutions with quadratics. Sometimes you have the same solution twice, but usually it's two different solutions. Let's look at a third and final example. Of course, you can pause if you need to take a closer look. So number 3. So we have something like x squared. This time I'm going to say minus, we'll say 12 is equal to x. Okay. Now, in this situation, we need a 0 for that zero product property that we talked about to work. Also, we really need everything on one side or else we can't factor as it is. So what I need is to get everything on one side. And that's a little bit against your intuition. When you're first learning quadratic equations, there's this tendency to think this is a good thing to have the x over here, but it's not. We want a 0 over here. Now, which side do you go to? Well, it's almost always a good idea to have a positive leading coefficient. If you remember, leading coefficient is the number for the highest power. We like that to be positive. It doesn't absolutely have to be that way. There's ways around it, but you're much better off with a positive one. So I'm going to move the x over here instead of trying to move to the right. This x is positive, so the way you move it is to subtract it like this. Of course, minus is the opposite of adding there. Now, when I put it on this side, sometimes, especially early, there's some mistakes. People will think that somehow these combine, or maybe this 12 and this x makes 11 somehow. But no, this is x squared, this is x first, this is a constant. None of those are going to combine. So you just write them side by side. And the way we like to write them is the highest power first, then the second highest, and then the smallest. This will be x to the second, x to the first, the 1 is understood. And this is actually x to the 0 because you don't see the x at all. So 2, 1, 0. That's called standard form. It's the way we like to write these. On the right-hand side, notice that we have 0. X minus x is 0. This is a good thing. It's not something you want for linear equations, which is x to the first power, but this is exactly what we want for quadratic equations. From here, you're going to factor. Remember, there's an understood 1 there. So I'm trying to multiply to negative 12 and at the same time add to negative 1. We've factored several things now, so I'll write this down. I'll just put the numbers in there. It's going to be minus 4 and positive 3. Excuse me. Minus 4 and positive 3 is what that is. Negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Negative 4 plus 3 is negative 1. So that works. But we have an equals 0. So we want to say x minus 4 is equal to 0. Or x plus 3 is equal to 0. I'm then going to add the 4. Easy to solve here. I'm going to subtract the 3. And those are my two solutions. Okay, so that's solving a quadratic equation using factoring.